Mia Lawson's shoulders ached as she made her way toward the bus stop. 3 morning classes, followed by an 8-hour shift at Common Grounds, the tiny coffee shop that helped her cover rent, had completely drained her. The November wind cut through her thin blue hoodie, a cruel reminder that winter was closing in, and she still couldn't afford a proper coat. The Route 27 bus pulled up right on time. Mia climbed aboard, flashing her worn-out monthly pass at the driver, a grumpy middle-aged man with perpetually furrowed brows, as if life itself had personally offended him. She shuffled toward the back, slumping into a seat by the window. The city lights blurred together, exhaustion settling into her bones. Then wait! A male voice called out just as the doors started to close. The driver groaned but reopened them, and a young man, early 20s, slightly out of breath, jumped on. He wore jeans and a simple gray sweater, yet somehow it still managed to look effortlessly expensive. His dark hair was a little messy, as if he had been walking against the wind for too long. There was something about his confident posture that made a few passengers glance up. "That'll be $3.50, the driver said flatly. The young man patted his pockets, a flicker of panic flashing across his face. I think I left my wallet in my other." He stopped mid-sentence, embarrassment settling in. The driver folded his arms. "No money. No ride." He motioned toward the door. "I've got a schedule to keep." Mia watched the exchange, recognizing that look of humiliation all too well. Without thinking, she stood up and walked forward, fishing into her pocket for the loose change she had left from today's tips. "Here," she said, offering $3.02. The young man turned, surprise evident in his deep brown eyes. For a moment, he seemed about to refuse, but then he exhaled and nodded, grateful. "Thank you. I'll pay you back somehow." Mia gave a tired smile. "Don't worry about it." Then she went back to her seat. The young man found a spot a few rows ahead, occasionally glancing back at her. But Mia barely noticed. Her mind was already spiraling through tomorrow's exam, the overdue electricity bill, and whether her mom had remembered to take her medication. What Mia couldn't know was that she had just helped James Calloway. The same James whose family owned Calloway Hotels, a luxury empire spanning 3 continents. The same James Calloway whose face occasionally appeared in business magazines beside headlines about the dynasty he was set to inherit. He looked back one more time at the girl in the faded blue hoodie. Her eyes now closed, exhaustion settling over her like a heavy weight. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar, something that had nothing to do with his last name or his family's wealth. As the bus rumbled through the city streets, 2 worlds briefly intersected. Neither of them aware that this small moment would change everything. Mia's fingers moved swiftly across the espresso machine, her hands operating on pure muscle memory. Steaming milk, grinding beans, pouring the perfect latte art. After 2 years at Common Grounds, it had all become second nature. The morning rush was brutal. A line of caffeine-deprived customers stretched to the door. Mia called out the next order, large caramel latte with almond milk. As she placed the cup on the counter, a familiar voice spoke from the other side. "I think I owe you a coffee." Mia slid the coffee cup across the counter without looking up. "Thanks," a familiar voice replied. She glanced up and froze. Standing before her was the guy from the bus, the one she had helped yesterday. In daylight, she noticed details she had missed in the dim bus lighting, a defined jawline, sharp yet kind eyes, and that same effortless elegance in the way he dressed. "It's you," she said, surprise evident in her voice. He smiled. "Told you I'd pay you back for the $3.50. Mia crossed her arms. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Maybe I just wanted good coffee," he replied, a playful glint in his eyes. "I'm James, by the way." "Mia," she answered automatically. Before she could say more, her coworker, Lily, nudged her urgently. "We've got 6 people waiting on drinks," Lily hissed. "Right, sorry." Mia turned back to James, but he was already dropping a $5 bill into the tip jar. "Thanks again, Mia." She watched as he chose a table by the window, pulling out a book rather than a phone, something that struck her as oddly refreshing. Throughout her shift, she caught him glancing up occasionally, their eyes meeting briefly before both looked away. When the rush finally died down, Mia grabbed a rag and moved to wipe down nearby tables. "So," she said, pausing by James' table, "do you make a habit of forgetting your wallet?" He laughed, closing his book. Not usually. Yesterday was unusual. Mia raised an eyebrow. Unusual how? James hesitated. Let's just say I'm trying something different with my life. She smirked. Mysterious. Not intentionally, he admitted, his tone suddenly earnest. I actually came back because, well, this might sound strange, but he hesitated. You're the first person who's done something nice for me without expecting anything in return. Mia blinked. It was just bus fare. James shook his head slightly. Still, I'd like to thank you properly. Maybe coffee sometime when you're not working? Mia studied him, trying to read his intentions. There was something he wasn't saying, but his eyes seemed genuine. I don't even know you. James shrugged. That's the point of coffee, isn't it? To get to know someone? Before she could answer, her manager called from behind the counter. Mia, break's over. James stood, grabbing his book. I'm here most mornings. Think about it. Mia nodded hesitantly before heading back behind the counter. Throughout the day, she kept glancing at the empty spot where he had sat, now occupied by a college student with headphones. She told herself it was ridiculous to feel disappointed when he didn't show up the next morning. But when he appeared the following day, casually ordering a black coffee and asking how her day was going, something warm flickered to life inside her chest. A feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time. What started as a chance encounter quickly became a routine. 2 weeks later, Mia found herself sitting across from James in a quiet corner of Common Grounds, a latte in hand. It was their 5th coffee meetup in just 14 days. So let me get this straight, Mia said, stirring her drink. You just decided to quit your corporate job and start over? James smirked. Something like that. His expression turned thoughtful. The family business, it wasn't who I wanted to be. Mia nodded, understanding more than he realized. My dad was like that, she admitted, her voice softer now. Had my whole life planned out, college, law school, joining his firm. The moment I chose art history instead, she let out a short laugh, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. He cut me off, stopped paying for anything. Haven't spoken to him in 3 years. James leaned forward. That's rough. Is that why you work so many hours here? Mia hesitated. She had never told anyone this, not even her friends. But something about James made it easy. That and helping my mom with rent. She swallowed. She's got health issues. For the first time in a long time, Mia felt like she wasn't just carrying the weight alone. She didn't realize then, this was just the beginning. With James, it was easy to open up, maybe too easy. Anyway, enough about my sad backstory, Mia said, shifting in her seat. What are you doing now? Job-wise? James leaned back, shrugging casually. Freelance consulting, nothing exciting. Mia arched an eyebrow. Mr. Mysterious strikes again. You never talk about your past, James smirked, because it's boring compared to hearing you talk about your passion for Renaissance art. Mia rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. Smooth deflection. The coffee shop was nearly empty now. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, painting the city in soft golden hues. Mia knew she should be heading home. She had reading to finish for tomorrow's class. But for some reason, she wasn't quite ready to end the conversation. Then, can I ask you something? James's voice was quieter now, more serious. Mia tilted her head. Depends on the question. He held her gaze. What do you want? Like, really want out of life? Mia blinked, caught off guard by the sudden depth of his question. I want to finish my degree. Get a job at a museum. She hesitated. Maybe curate my own exhibition someday. She let out a small laugh. And not worry about money constantly. That would be nice. That's it? James asked. No dreams of world travel? A huge mansion? Mia shook her head. Those things cost money I don't have. She smiled. I'm practical, but if money wasn't an issue, I'd take my mom to Italy. She's always wanted to see Florence. She tilted her head. Your turn. What do you want, James? Whatever your last name is. James smiled, but his eyes held something she couldn't quite read. Freedom, he said simply. To just be me, not what others expect me to be. Mia's voice softened. And who is the real you? James hesitated. I'm still figuring that out. His gaze locked onto hers. But I feel more like myself when I'm with you than I have in a long time. The confession hung between them, honest and unguarded. Mia's chest tightened, an unfamiliar flutter of something both exciting and terrifying at the same time. She cleared her throat, breaking the moment. I should go, she said, gathering her things. Early class tomorrow. James nodded, walking her to the door. Same time next week? Mia hesitated, then surprised herself by saying, maybe sooner. There's a student exhibition at my college Friday night. James didn't even pause. I'd love to go. As they parted ways, Mia realized something. For the first time in years, she was letting someone new into her carefully built world. She wasn't sure if it was wise, but something about James made her want to take the risk. What she didn't see was James's face as she walked away. The conflict, the guilt shadowing his expression. And the phone he pulled out, a phone far too expensive for the simple life he claimed to live. The university gallery buzzed with conversation as students and faculty moved between the displays, murmuring about the artwork on the walls. Mia stood beside a series of black and white photographs, not her own, but a friend's work. She adjusted the small information card beneath one of the frames, speaking to a professor nearby. He's exploring urban decay as a metaphor for forgotten communities. The professor nodded politely, but Mia's attention kept drifting to the entrance. James was 20 minutes late. She checked her phone. No messages. Maybe he wasn't coming. Maybe she had imagined his interest. Then, sorry I'm late. Mia turned. James stood there, slightly out of breath, his dark hair windblown. Couldn't find parking. Mia frowned. You drove? James hesitated for half a second. Borrowed a friend's car. Mia raised an eyebrow. I thought you took the bus. James brushed off the question quickly. This exhibition meant a lot to you, so? Mia studied him for a second. Then she let it go. I'm glad you made it. Let me show you around. As they walked through the gallery, Mia started noticing things. Little things. Like how James' simple watch, which he kept trying to hide under his sleeve, looked suspiciously like a luxury brand she'd seen in magazine ads. Or how his knowledge of art was far too deep for someone who had claimed to never take an interest in it before. There were inconsistencies. And for the first time, Mia wondered. Who exactly was James Calloway? James had an answer for everything. Maybe that's what made Mia suspicious. For someone who claimed to have a standard business background, he seemed far too knowledgeable about art, history, and things that didn't align with a simple, freelance consultant job. And when his phone rang during the exhibition, he stepped away to answer it in hushed tones. When he returned, there was a tightness around his eyes. Mia frowned. Everything okay? James muttered. Just work. Sorry about that. But the way he avoided her gaze told her it was something more. Later, as they stood before a striking abstract painting, Mia gathered her courage. James, can I ask you something? He turned to her, his expression unreadable. Of course. She hesitated, then went for it. Who are you really? James stiffened. What do you mean? Mia gestured vaguely, searching for the right words. That watch you're wearing? It costs more than my entire semester's tuition. You know way too much about 16th century Italian masters for someone who supposedly took just one art history class. And every time I ask about your family or where you live, you change the subject. James let out a slow sigh, running a hand through his hair. I told you, I worked in corporate. Mia didn't back down. Which corporation? Silence. Then James slowly unfastened the expensive watch from his wrist and held it out to her. It was my grandfather's. A family heirloom. Mia studied his face, searching for the truth. She wanted to believe him. The past few weeks with James had been the brightest part of her exhausting life. When they were together, talking about books, debating different artistic movements, she felt understood in a way she never had before. James watched her carefully, then spoke softly. I like you, Mia. Isn't that what matters? A part of her wanted to push further, demand the whole truth. But the vulnerability in his eyes made her pause. Instead, she said, just don't lie to me, okay? I've had enough people walk out of my life. I don't need more disappointment. James reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I'm not going anywhere. As they continued through the gallery, Mia told herself to be content with what James was willing to share. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was only seeing a carefully constructed version of him. A canvas with large portions left deliberately blank. What she didn't realize was how quickly those blank spaces would be filled in, whether James wanted them to be or not. Mia's shift ended later than usual, thanks to a coworker calling in sick. By the time she finished wiping down the last tables at Common Grounds, the city outside was quiet, bathed in moonlight and the occasional glow of passing headlights. She was surprised to find James still there, sitting at his usual table. He had been nursing a series of coffees, working on his laptop. "You didn't have to wait," Mia said, untying her apron. James closed his computer. "I wanted to." Then, with a small smile, "Besides, it's late. Thought I'd walk you to the bus stop." Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Mia pulled her hoodie tighter around herself as they walked, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Then, "You know what I realized today?" James asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Mia glanced at him. "What?" "It's been exactly 1 month since you saved me on the bus." Mia laughed. "Saved you?" "It was $3.50. James shook his head, his expression suddenly serious. "It was more than that." Mia slowed her pace. "What do you mean?" James hesitated, then exhaled. "That day, I was trying something new, stepping away from." He paused. "From what?" Mia prompted. James shook his head. "It doesn't matter." Then his eyes met hers, steady and sincere. "What matters is, meeting you changed things for me." They had reached the bus shelter now, empty except for them. Mia studied his face in the dim glow of the streetlights. And then, without really thinking, she said, "You know what I think?" James raised an eyebrow. "Getting philosophical, art girl?" Mia smiled. "Maybe, but my mom always says there are no accidents in the universe." James tilted his head, intrigued. "And what does your mom think about me?" "She thinks it's suspicious that you've never come over for dinner." James smirked, stepping just a little closer. "Is that an invitation?" Mia hesitated, because for the first time she realized letting James into her life? That might change everything. Mia's apartment was small, nothing like the kind of place she imagined James was used to, whatever his background really was. She hesitated before unlocking the door. "Maybe if you promise not to judge our mismatched plates and the fact that the elevator breaks down twice a week." James smiled. "I would never." His voice was soft, almost reverent. The air between them shifted, charged with something neither of them had acknowledged until now. Mia suddenly became aware of how close they were standing, of James' eyes flickering down to her lips. "Mia," he whispered, "I've wanted to." She didn't let him finish. On instinct, she rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his. A gentle question, one that James answered immediately, pulling her closer, his hand cradling her face with unexpected tenderness. When they finally broke apart, Mia felt lightheaded, her heart pounding beneath her ribs. James let out a breathless laugh, his forehead resting against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks." Mia smiled, still dizzy from the moment. "What took you so long?" A pair of headlights cut through the darkness, the bus approaching. Reluctantly, Mia took a step back. "I'll see you tomorrow?" she asked. James nodded. "Definitely." As the bus carried her home, Mia touched her lips, replaying the moment over and over. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope, to want something more than just surviving each day. Whatever secrets James was keeping, whatever complications lay ahead, tonight had felt real, a beginning. What she couldn't see was James, still standing at the bus stop, his expression torn between joy and mounting guilt. James paced across his hotel suite, phone pressed to his ear. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the city lights, twinkling like fallen stars against the night sky. 3 weeks had passed since his first kiss with Mia, and each day, the weight of his deception grew heavier. "I need more time, Dad," he said, tension in his voice. "The Singapore project can wait." A clipped response. "Nothing can wait in this business." James closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter. Richard Calloway, CEO of Calloway Hotels, spoke with the cold efficiency of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. "You've been finding yourself for nearly 2 months now," his father continued. "The board is asking questions." James exhaled sharply. "I'm not finding myself. I'm learning how real people live." His father's laugh was cold. "Playing poor isn't going to make you a better CEO, son. It's going to make you soft." James glanced at his watch. The same one Mia had noticed, the one he had tried to pass off as a family heirloom. In 30 minutes, he was supposed to meet her for dinner at her apartment. He had finally agreed to meet her mother. James turned toward the mirror, staring at his own reflection. Who was he trying to fool? Every morning he left this luxury suite, changed into regular clothes in a public restroom, and pretended to be someone he wasn't. all so he could spend time with a woman who valued honesty above everything else. Mia's voice echoed in his mind. Just don't lie to me. But he had. Every day, every conversation. The smell of homemade lasagna filled the small apartment. Mia's mother, Maria, moved slowly around the kitchen, her cane tapping against the worn linoleum floor. She glanced at the old clock on the wall. He's late. Mia adjusted the mismatched plates on their tiny dining table. Only by 10 minutes, Mom, he'll be here. As if summoned by her confidence. A knock sounded at the door. Mia wiped her hands on a towel and headed toward it. Maria gave her a knowing look. Let's see what kind of man this James really is. But what Mia didn't know was that James stood on the other side of the door with a secret that could destroy everything. Mia smoothed her dress, a thrift store find she had spent hours altering, and took a deep breath before opening the door. James stood in the hallway, clutching a bouquet of lilies and a bottle of wine, one that Mia suspected cost more than her entire weekly grocery budget. Sorry I'm late, he said, his eyes conveying more apology than his words. Work call ran long. Mia accepted the flowers with a small smile. Come in, Mom's been dying to meet you. Dinner was surprisingly easy. Maria shared embarrassing stories from Mia's childhood, while James charmed them both with his genuine interest and respectful questions about Maria's life before her illness. Then, so James, Maria said as they finished dessert, Mia tells me you're in consulting. What kind exactly? James hesitated, the familiar panic rising whenever his fabricated background was questioned. Hotel management, primarily. Maria nodded. My late husband always said you can tell everything about a person by how they treat service workers. James met Mia's gaze across the table. I couldn't agree more. Later, as Mia walked him to the door, she whispered, She loves you, I can tell. James pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. For a moment he thought, tell her now, tell her the truth. Mia, there's something I need to tell you. She pulled back slightly, studying his troubled expression. What is it? The words died in his throat. How could he explain that he wasn't just some ordinary guy, that his family controlled a billion-dollar empire, that soon he'd be expected to return to a world where people like Mia were invisible? Instead, he forced a smile. Nothing. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Just, thank you for tonight. As he kissed her goodbye, James knew he was running out of time. The truth was coming, one way or another. The Wednesday afternoon rush at Common Grounds had finally slowed. Mia wiped down the espresso machine, humming quietly to herself. The past few weeks with James had been like something from a movie. Late-night conversations, weekend walks through the park, stolen kisses between shifts. For once, her life felt balanced, despite her hectic schedule. Then, can I get a cappuccino? Mia looked up to see a woman in her mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a press badge hanging around her neck. Coming right up, Mia replied, starting the drink. The bell above the door chimed. James walked in, his face lighting up the moment he saw her, but he barely had time to register the familiar face of a businessman from his father's company, standing in line. Then, James? The man squinted, pulling out his phone. No way. James stiffened, his body going cold. A few customers turned their heads. You look different, the man said, eyes drifting to James's worn jeans and coffee-stained sweater. Before James could react, a woman's voice cut through the room. James Calloway? Mia froze. The journalist near the counter was already pulling out her phone. James's face paled. Melissa, don't. But it was too late. The camera clicked. Flash. Flash. What are you doing here? Melissa smirked, her tone sharp. Does your father know you're slumming it in coffee shops? Or is this some kind of publicity stunt? Mia felt the room tilting. The cappuccino overflowed, hot milk spilling across the counter. She barely noticed. Her mind was stuck on one thing. Calloway. As in Calloway Hotels. As in the luxury chain whose billboards loomed over the city. Her breath caught. James Calloway. Not just James. Not the guy who forgot his wallet on the bus. Not the guy who had spent weeks pretending to be just like her. James took a step toward her. Mia, I can explain. Melissa let out a low, satisfied laugh. Oh, this is rich. Literally. She turned to Mia, amusement flickering in her eyes. Sweetheart, do you work here? How long have you known him? James's jaw clenched. She's not part of this. His voice was sharp. Leave her alone. But the damage was done. The journalist already had her story. And Mia? Mia was realizing she had fallen for a lie. Melissa was already typing on her phone, a triumphant smirk on her lips. Hotel heir James Calloway spotted at local coffee shop. New life or just a game? She muttered as she wrote, "This will go viral within the hour." Mia moved mechanically, wiping up the spilled milk, but her mind was racing. Every conversation, every moment with James, reframing them all in this new, devastating context. "Mia, please." James reached across the counter, his eyes pleading. "So it's true?" Mia's coworker Lily stood nearby, arms crossed, glaring at James. "You're that James Calloway?" Mia turned sharply. "You knew?" Lily shook her head. "No, but now it makes sense." She scoffed, looking disgusted. "You always tipped way too much. And that watch?" Lily let out a bitter laugh. "I thought it was fake. Guess not." James swallowed hard, guilt tightening in his chest. Mia took a step back, her voice hollow. "Were you ever going to tell me?" James exhaled. "Yes, I was trying to find the right time." Mia let out a short, humorless laugh. "The right time was before I fell for you." Her voice broke on the last word. A sharp silence hung between them. Lily reappeared from the back, sensing the tension. "Everything okay, Mia?" Mia forced a tight smile. "Fine." She untied her apron. "I'm taking my break." Without another word to James, she walked toward the staff room, closing the door behind her. Only then did she allow the tears to fall. "Leave me alone, James." Mia quickened her pace, exiting through the back door of the coffee shop. Her shift had ended, but the humiliation still burned. James followed her into the alley, desperate. "Mia, please, just give me 5 minutes." She whirled around, eyes flashing. 5 minutes? Her voice shook with anger. "You had 2 months to tell me the truth. 2 months of watching me count tips and stress over my mom's medical bills, while you—" her voice caught. "While you what? Played poor for fun?" James shook his head, frustration mixing with guilt. "It wasn't like that. When we met on that bus, I was trying to experience life without the Calloway name hanging over me. For once, I wanted someone to see just me." Mia's lips parted in disbelief. "But it wasn't just you, was it?" Her voice dropped dangerously low. "It was a character you created. The struggling consultant, the humble guy rebuilding his life." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "God, I feel so stupid." Mia stepped closer now, anger overtaking the hurt. "Everything I told you about myself, my thoughts, my feelings, my dreams, that was all real." She swallowed hard, except the part where you're heir to a billion-dollar empire. James had no defense. People passed by on the main street, some glancing curiously at their heated exchange. Mia took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. Then, "Do you know what the worst part is?" Her voice was quieter now. "I trusted you. I let you meet my mom. I told you things I've never told anyone." Tears threatened again, but she blinked them back. "And all that time, you were lying to my face." James reached for her hand, but she stepped away. "Mia, I was going to tell you. I swear. I didn't know how without losing you." A cruel irony settled between them, because in trying to keep her, he had lost her anyway. Mia pulled her phone from her pocket, turning the screen toward him. The journalist's post had already been shared thousands of times, complete with photos of James at the coffee shop and speculation about his secret romance with a barista. Her voice wavered, raw with betrayal. "By tomorrow, everyone will know. My coworkers, my classmates." She exhaled shakily. Was it worth it? Her eyes locked onto his, searching for something she no longer recognized. "Your little experiment in being normal?" James' face crumpled, regret written all over him. "You were never part of an experiment." His voice broke on the words. "What I feel for you is real." Mia's breath hitched, but she shook her head. "I don't even know who you are." James took a step forward. "Mia, please don't contact me again." She turned, and this time, she didn't look back. Mia kept walking. Every step took her further from the future she had foolishly begun to imagine. Behind her, James remained rooted to the spot, watching the only genuine connection he'd ever known disappear around the corner. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fix it. James stood on the marble balcony of the Calloway estate, staring out at the manicured gardens below, but he wasn't really seeing them. 3 days had passed since Mia walked away. 3 days of unanswered texts, 3 days of calls that went straight to voicemail, and yet, the emptiness in his chest hadn't faded. It had only grown. "I told you it wouldn't work." His father's voice cut through the cold evening air. Richard Calloway approached with deliberate steps, a glass of scotch in hand, playing at being ordinary. James didn't turn around. I wasn't playing at anything. Richard raised an eyebrow. Then what would you call abandoning your responsibilities to pour coffee and chase after some girl who works for minimum wage? James' jaw tightened. Her name is Mia. Richard placed his untouched drink on the railing. And I wasn't abandoning anything. James exhaled sharply. I was trying to understand what our company actually means to real people. Richard let out a humorless laugh. Real people, as opposed to what? Unreal people like us? James turned to him. You know what I mean. Richard's gaze sharpened. I know you've embarrassed this family. He picked up his drink again, swirling the amber liquid. The board meeting is tomorrow. The Singapore expansion won't wait for your identity crisis to resolve itself. James forced himself to stay calm. I'm not coming back, Dad. Richard's glass hit the railing with a sharp clink. Oh, you think you're not coming back? He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. But you will. James clenched his fists. I'm not a child. No, but you're still legally bound to the company. Richard took a slow sip of his drink. Unless you want a courtroom battle over every cent you've ever spent in your little experiment. James's stomach tightened. You wouldn't do that. His father's voice was cold. Try me. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. You're either my son, or you're just another problem I need to solve. James turned away, gripping the balcony railing so hard his knuckles turned white. Richard downed the rest of his drink. The helicopter leaves for the board meeting at 9. He set the empty glass down. I expect you to be on it, properly dressed, ready to take your rightful place. James didn't move. He listened as his father's footsteps faded down the hall. Then he pulled out his phone. Mia's name stared back at him. His thumb hovered over her contact. What could he possibly say that would make a difference now? I'm sorry. I love you. I'm still the same person you fell for. With a sudden clarity, James realized if he wanted to change his life, he had to stop trying to fit into someone else's version of it. Neither his father's nor Mia's. For the first time, he had to find his own path, one that wasn't defined by expectations or regrets. Mia's pencil moved across the page, swift and angry. The library was quiet except for the occasional turning of pages and the soft tapping of keyboards. 3 weeks had passed since the truth about James exploded into her life, and she had thrown herself into schoolwork with relentless determination. If she was exhausted, at least she was productive. If she was heartbroken, at least she wasn't thinking about it. Then, that doesn't look like Renaissance art to me. Mia's classmate, Jen, peered over her shoulder. Mia glanced down at her sketchpad. Instead of delicate portrait studies, she had drawn something else entirely. A cityscape. Dark, chaotic lines. Something that felt more like her emotional state than anything from art history. Mia sighed, flipping the page. Just clearing my head. Jen pulled out her phone. Have you seen this? She slid it across the table. Mia's stomach dropped. On the screen, a headline and a photo of James Calloway. Mia stared at the screen, her heart lurching against her will. A business news article. Hotel heir James Calloway resigns from family business, shocking board and investors. Beneath the headline was a formal photo of James in a sharp suit, looking nothing like the man she had known. Isn't that your coffee shop guy? Jen, her classmate, asked. The one who… Yes. Mia cut her off, shoving the phone away. And I really don't want to talk about it. After her shift at Common Grounds, Mia helped her mother prepare dinner. The small apartment felt safe, a world away from high-rise offices and billion-dollar decisions. Maria stirred a pot of soup on the stove, glancing at her daughter. You're quiet tonight. Mia shrugged. Busy day. Maria didn't buy it. Is it the boy, James? Mia nearly dropped the plate she was holding. Mom, please. Maria continued unfazed. Your father wasn't always the man you remember. She set down the spoon. When we met, he was kind, idealistic. Money changed him, not the other way around. Mia's stomach tightened. This isn't about Dad, but she couldn't ignore the parallels staring her in the face. James had lied to her, for months. He had watched her struggle to make ends meet, while he was probably going home to a penthouse every night. Maria, ever patient, just said, maybe. Or maybe he was struggling in ways you couldn't see. Mia wanted to argue, but instead fragments of conversations surfaced in her mind. James's tense expression whenever his phone rang. His offhand comments about expectations and freedom, had there been truth buried within the lies? It doesn't matter anymore, Mia said firmly. He's gone back to his world, and I'm still here in mine, exactly where I belong. But later that night, as she worked on a term paper, Mia found herself searching for more news about James's resignation. The articles revealed little, just corporate statements about pursuing other opportunities and speculation about family tensions. Mia closed her laptop, determined to focus on what she could control: her education, her job, taking care of her mom. Still, as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but wonder, where was James tonight? And did he ever think of her? The campus coffee shop wasn't as good as Common Grounds, but Mia needed a change of scenery. She couldn't risk running into reminders of James at work. 2 months had passed since their final confrontation in the alley. The gossip had finally begun to fade. Until Mia Gardner? She looked up from her textbook. A tall, well-dressed man approached her table. Something about his confident stride felt familiar. "I'm James," he said, extending a hand. "James Whitaker. I'm a friend of James Calloway's, from business school." Mia stiffened. "I'm not interested in talking about James. Just 5 minutes." Before she could object, he sat down across from her. "I saw you through the window," James Whitaker said, "and I couldn't pass up the chance to set something straight." Mia folded her arms. "There's nothing to set straight. He lied. End of story." James studied her for a moment. Then he asked, "Did you know James was supposed to take over as CEO this year?" Mia's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "So?" "So he hated it. All of it." James Whitaker leaned forward. The expectations, the privilege, the way people treated him like he was nothing but a bank account. Mia said nothing, because for the first time she wanted to hear more. "The day he met you on that bus?" Whitaker continued. He had just walked out of a board meeting after telling his father he needed time away. Mia's heart clenched. She had spent months thinking their meeting was an accident, but maybe it wasn't. She took a slow breath. "Why are you telling me this?" James Whitaker's expression softened. "Because James is gone." Mia's pulse spiked. "Gone?" Whitaker nodded. "He quit, walked away from everything." Mia stared at him, her mind racing. James Calloway had left his entire empire behind, but for what? And why did it still feel like it was too late? He refused his trust fund, left the company. No one knows where he is, not even his family. Mia stared at James Whitaker, trying to process the words. The news hit her harder than she expected. "That's extreme." "Is it?" Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "Or is it exactly what he told you he wanted?" Mia's breath caught. She remembered that conversation in the coffee shop. "What do you want?" she had asked. "Freedom," James had answered. "To just be me." At the time, she had thought it was just some abstract desire. But now, he had actually done it, walked away from it all, for real. "Look," Whitaker continued, "I'm not saying you should forgive him for lying, but maybe consider that your relationship with him was the most honest thing in his life, even with the omissions." Mia said nothing. She just sat there as Whitaker stood to leave, her textbook forgotten, her mind spinning. For weeks, she had been so focused on how James had deceived her. She had never considered what their relationship might have meant to him. On her walk home, Mia passed a newsstand. A business magazine cover caught her eye. "Calloway Hotels faces uncertain future without heir apparent." She stopped in her tracks. For the first time since their breakup, Mia allowed herself to wonder. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to James' story than she had been willing to see. The Pinecrest Lodge sat nestled against the mountains, its weathered wooden sign swinging gently in the breeze. It was nothing like the gleaming Calloway hotels, with their crystal chandeliers and marble floors. This place had character, peeling paint, creaking floorboards, a charm that couldn't be manufactured. "You missed a spot." Marcus, the 60-year-old owner, pointed to the far corner of the reception desk. James, now just James, glanced down at the varnish cloth in his hand. "Sorry," he muttered, rubbing harder. After 3 weeks of working at the small independent lodge, he was still getting used to taking orders instead of giving them. His staff quarters were about the size of his former bathroom. The pay barely covered essentials. And yet, despite everything, James felt lighter than he had in years. "There's a leak in cabin 7, Marcus said, dropping a toolbox beside him. "Think you can handle it?" 2 months ago, James would have called maintenance. Now, He nodded confidently, even though he had only a vague idea how to fix a leaky pipe. Later, soaked but victorious after battling the plumbing, James sat on the lodge's back porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. His basic flip phone, a far cry from the latest smartphone he once carried, buzzed with a text from Whitaker. "Your father announced the new CEO today. Stock dropped 3%. James smirked. That stock drop would infuriate his father, but it wasn't his problem anymore. Nothing about Callaway Hotels was his concern now. He typed back, better than expected, learning actual skills for once. That evening, a young family checked into the lodge. As James handed them their room key, their little girl stared up at the moose head mounted on the wall. "Is it real?" she whispered. James leaned over the counter, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Between you and me, I think it might wink if you watch long enough." The girl's eyes went wide. Then, she giggled. Her parents smiled gratefully. Such a small interaction. And yet, it filled James with a satisfaction he had never felt in the corporate world. Because these people didn't care about his last name or his bank account. Here he was just James, the friendly guy at the front desk. That night, as moths danced around the porch light, James reached into his wallet. He pulled out a photograph. It was of Mia. Taken one afternoon at the park, her face mid-laugh, autumn leaves swirling around her. He traced the edges of the photo, exhaling slowly. Sometimes he considered calling her, telling her about his new life, asking for another chance. But then, the doubt always crept in. What right did he have? Mia deserved someone who had never lied to her, someone who hadn't betrayed her trust. So instead of dialing her number, James did what he had been doing for weeks. He tucked the photo away and tried to convince himself that he had made the right choice. On nights like this, with the weight of the Callaway legacy finally off his shoulders, James allowed himself to imagine a different ending to their story. One where he had found the courage to tell Mia the truth before it was too late. Maybe someday he would be worthy of a second chance. For now, learning to be truly himself was enough. "You should go find him." Clink. Lisa slid a freshly made latte across the counter. "You should go find him." Mia looked up, startled. "Excuse me?" "James?" Lisa folded her arms. "You know where he is. What's stopping you?" 3 months had passed since Mia learned the truth about James. 3 months of throwing herself into work and school, of trying to forget. But the ache remained. Stubborn, persistent. And say what? Mia wiped down the espresso machine with a little too much force. "Hey, remember me? The girl you lied to for months?" Lisa rolled her eyes. "James already told you where James is. Some mountain lodge, right?" Mia hesitated. She had shared the encounter with James Whitaker weeks ago. But she had conveniently left out the part where he had slipped her a note with James's whereabouts. The Pinecrest Lodge, 6 hours north, by bus. Mia exhaled. Pride. Lisa raised an eyebrow. And fear. That evening, Mia sat across from her mother at their tiny kitchen table. The smell of homemade stew filled the apartment. Maria's health had improved slightly in recent weeks, enough that she could cook dinner for the first time in months. Then, he lied to me. Mia stabbed at her food with her fork, for weeks, maybe months, and now he just walks away from it all, like that changes anything? Maria looked at her carefully. "And yet, you're still thinking about him." Mia let out a frustrated sigh, leaning back in her chair. "I hate that I am." She crossed her arms. "But I need to know if he really changed, or if he's just playing another role." Maria nodded knowingly, then, gently, "Then go find out." Mia blinked. "You knew?" Maria smiled. "Mia, you check business news websites daily. You've barely dated since he left. And sometimes," she hesitated, "you say his name in your sleep." Mia's face burned. Maria reached across the table, squeezing her daughter's hand. "The question isn't whether you should go. It's why you haven't gone already." Later that night, Mia pulled out her laptop and looked up bus schedules. The ticket price would eat into her savings, money she had been putting aside for next semester's books. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the confirm purchase button. Was James worth the risk? Then, she remembered, his face the last time she saw him. Devastated, pleading. She had been so focused on her own anger, justified, but perhaps incomplete. There were two sides to every story, and she had only allowed herself to see one. She thought about what James Whitaker had told her, about James walking away from everything he'd ever known, about his search for something real in a world built on appearances. Wasn't that what she had always wanted, too? Authenticity in a world of masks? Before she could change her mind, Mia booked the ticket. Friday, after her final exam and before her weekend shift, she would have exactly 24 hours to find James, to say what she needed to say, and then to return. What would she say when she saw him? Mia wasn't sure. Part of her wanted to scream at him again for his deception. Another part wanted to understand why he had chosen this path. And a small, persistent voice wondered if they could start over, this time with no lies between them. As Mia closed her laptop, she felt something she hadn't in months. Hope. The Pinecrest Lodge looked exactly like its website photo. Rustic, charming, and worlds away from the luxury hotels that bore the Callaway name. Mia stood at the edge of the gravel parking lot, her small overnight bag clutched in one hand. Doubt flooded her mind. What if James didn't want to see her? What if he had moved on? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a step forward, and then another. Because no matter the answer, she needed to know. Mia stood frozen at the edge of the gravel parking lot, her overnight bag clutched tightly in her hand. What if this was a mistake? What if he didn't want to see her? Before she could turn back, the lodge's front door swung open. A family emerged, laughing, heading toward their car. The warm, homey scene was so different from the world James Callaway had come from. Yet, it was exactly where he had chosen to be. Mia took a deep breath and walked forward. The reception area smelled of pine and fresh coffee. A fire crackled in a stone hearth and hiking maps lined the walls. Behind the desk, an older man with a gray beard looked up as she entered. "Welcome to Pinecrest Lodge," he greeted warmly. "Checking in?" "Actually," Mia hesitated. "I'm looking for someone who works here." "James Callaway." The man's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "And you are?" "Mia Gardner. I'm a friend." Before he could respond, a door behind the desk swung open, and James appeared. A stack of fresh towels balanced in his arms. For a moment, time stopped. His hair was longer. His face was tanned, more rugged. He wore a simple flannel shirt with the lodge's logo embroidered on the sleeve. Nothing like the casually expensive clothes he had once worn. His eyes met hers, and the towels nearly slipped from his grasp. "Mia." His voice was barely a whisper. She drank in the sight of him. The man who had lied to her. The man who had walked away from everything. The man she had tried to forget. And yet, standing here now, she realized she had never stopped thinking about him. "Hi," she managed. Suddenly, all the words she had rehearsed on the bus ride disappeared. The older man glanced between them, then cleared his throat. "Take your break, James. I'll cover the desk." Neither of them spoke as James led her outside to a small patio overlooking the mountains. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, turning everything golden. James leaned against the wooden railing. "You found me." Mia nodded. "James told me where you were." She hesitated. "I almost didn't come." "I'm glad you did." His eyes searched her face as if trying to understand why she was here. "Why did you?" Mia turned toward the mountains, gathering her thoughts. "I needed to know if any of it was real." She took a deep breath. "Us, I mean." James didn't hesitate. "All of it was real." His voice was steady, certain, "except the parts I didn't tell you." A silence stretched between them. Finally, Mia turned to face him directly. "If money doesn't define you," she asked, "then what does?" James's expression softened. A small smile played at the corner of his lips. "Who I choose to be." The simple answer hung in the air between them. Mia realized James had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not an escape from his name, but the freedom to define himself on his own terms. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And who is that?" Instead of answering, James extended his hand. "Would you like to find out?" They sat on a fallen log, overlooking a small creek. The afternoon sun filtered through pine branches, casting golden patterns on the ground. For the first time, there were no pretenses between them, no coffee shop counter, no hidden identities, just two people trying to find their way back to something real. James took a deep breath. "I shouldn't have lied to you." His voice was quiet against the backdrop of rushing water. "Not for a single day." Mia nodded. "Why did you?" James exhaled, picking up a pine cone, rolling it between his fingers. "That first day on the bus, when you helped me?" He turned the pine cone over in his hands. "No one had ever seen me as just a person before. Mia's breath caught. I was terrified of losing that. His voice was raw now, vulnerable. Every day I meant to tell you, and every day I convinced myself to wait a little longer. Mia's heart ached at the quiet confession. "Tell me everything now," she said. "No more half-truths." James met her gaze, and this time he didn't hesitate. He told her about growing up in the shadow of his father's empire, the expectations placed on him since childhood, the emptiness of a world where relationships were transactions, and every kindness came with unspoken conditions. "The day I met you," he continued, "I had just told my father I needed time away." Mia's breath hitched. "You left your wallet behind on purpose." James nodded. "I wanted to see what would happen if I had nothing." Mia swallowed hard. "And then I helped you." James smiled, small, almost wistful. "You did." Mia looked down at the water, watching the sunlight dance over the ripples. She had only seen her side of the story. She had never stopped to imagine his. Mia turned back to James. There was still one thing she needed to know. "If I hadn't come here today, would you have ever reached out?" James looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, "I thought about it every single day." Mia's heart pounded, because in that moment, she knew the truth. This had never been a game to him. She had been real, and so had they. But could they start over, with no lies between them? That was a question only time could answer. It was the most honest interaction I'd had in years. James's voice was quiet as he recalled that first night on the bus, the night Mia had handed him $3.50 without hesitation. A complete stranger helping another with no expectations, no ulterior motives. That moment changed everything. Mia listened carefully as James explained what had happened after their falling out. How he had walked away from everything, refused his inheritance, and found his way to Pinecrest Lodge, with nothing but a determination to build a life on his own terms. "I make $9 an hour plus tips," James admitted, rubbing his tired eyes. "Last week, I had to choose between fixing my boots or buying groceries. I live in a room the size of a closet, and I still haven't figured out how to sleep without hearing every creak in the old wooden walls." He let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "But I've never been happier." Mia studied him, searching his face for any hint of regret. "Are you really never going back?" she asked. "To any of it?" James met her gaze directly. "I don't know what my future holds, but I know I'll never go back to living a lie, whether it's with my family or with you." The sun dipped lower, painting the mountains in hues of burnt orange and soft pink. Mia glanced at her phone screen. Her bus back to the city would leave in a few hours. Time was running out. For this conversation, for whatever this reunion was meant to be. She exhaled, feeling the weight of her own emotions pressing down on her. "I came here because I needed closure," she admitted. "But now, I'm not sure what I want." James studied her, his voice gentle. "What are you afraid of?" Mia considered the question. "That you've changed, but not enough. That we're still from different worlds. That this isn't enough time to rebuild trust." Finally, she said aloud, "That this isn't enough time." James nodded, his expression solemn. "You're right. There was no quick fix for what had happened between them. But the honesty between them now, painful, freeing, it was something real. A foundation that hadn't existed before. Fragile, but real." Dusk settled over the mountains as they walked back toward the lodge. Their conversation had cleared the air, but left them in an uncertain place. Neither together, nor fully apart. Mia's bus would leave in less than an hour. "I can drive you to the station," James offered as they approached the main building. Warm light spilling from its windows. "Thanks." Mia tried to ignore the heaviness in her chest. What had she expected from this journey? A fairy tale ending? A dramatic reconciliation? Life wasn't that simple. Inside the lodge's small kitchen, James moved instinctively, preparing 2 cups of coffee. Mia watched, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. Old habits. James smirked slightly, sliding a cup toward her. "Old habits," he said, as if reading her mind. Their fingers brushed briefly. Mia wrapped her hands around the mug, taking a small sip. "This is good coffee?" James's lips twitched. "Not as good as yours." The simple compliment hung between them, a reminder of where they started and how far they'd come. Finally, Mia voiced the question that had been lingering since she arrived. "What happens now?" James leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "That depends on what you want, Mia." She blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected him to turn the question back on her. "I've made my choice," James said quietly. "I chose honesty, even if it meant losing everything I thought I needed. But I can't make your choice for you." Mia stared into her coffee, searching for answers in its depths. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know if I can trust you again." James's expression didn't falter. "That's fair." Mia hesitated. "But I also don't know if I want to walk away without giving us a real chance." Outside, the lodge's old pickup truck sat waiting to take her to the bus station. Time was running out. "We could start small," James suggested. "Phone calls, visits when you can manage them." Mia frowned. "Long distance is hard enough without adding trust issues." James nodded, accepting her point without argument. This new version of him, patient, humble, willing to accept difficult truths. It was both strange and compelling. Mia let out a slow breath. "I should go." She glanced at the clock. "My mom's expecting me back tomorrow." James said nothing, but his eyes held something unspoken. As they stepped outside, the cold mountain air bit at Mia's skin. 1,000 unspoken words hung between them. James opened the passenger door for her. Mia hesitated, one foot inside the truck, before she turned back to him, heart pounding. "James." His gaze snapped to hers. There was still one thing she needed to say, but the words caught in her throat. James took a step closer, waiting. Would she say it, or let this moment slip away? Mia hesitated for just a second. Then she made a decision. "Coffee." James blinked. "What?" Mia met his gaze directly. "Let's start with coffee, next Saturday. My day off. You come to the city, we meet somewhere neutral. No promises beyond that." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It wasn't a relationship. Not anymore. But it was a possibility. A door left deliberately ajar. James's smile was cautious, hopeful. "I'd like that." As the truck rumbled down the winding mountain road, streetlights flickering on in the darkening forest, Mia realized something. Sometimes the bravest choice wasn't walking away, and it wasn't jumping in blindly. Sometimes it was simply remaining open to what might come next. Mia adjusted her blazer as she walked through the museum's marble hallway. After 2 years as a curatorial assistant, today marked her first exhibition opening. Renaissance women, forgotten artists of Florence, occupied the museum's east wing, the culmination of her graduate thesis. Nervous, her colleague Thomas asked, straightening a placard beside a 16th-century portrait. Mia exhaled, terrified. Visitors would arrive in 30 minutes. Her phone buzzed. "Mom, so proud of you. See you at 7. The next message made her smile. "James, running late? Traffic. Save me some of those fancy hors d'oeuvres." Mia tucked her phone away. Their path back to each other hadn't been straightforward. That first coffee date led to another. Then weekend visits to the lodge. For months, they existed in a careful middle ground. Not quite together, not quite apart. When James eventually returned to the city, it wasn't to rejoin Callaway Hotels. Instead, he launched a small consulting firm, helping independent hotels compete against luxury chains. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Mia straightened a frame on the wall, remembering how James had helped her hang sketches in her tiny apartment while she prepared her exhibition proposal. How he had been there through rejection letters and eventual acceptance. Just as she had supported him through reconciling with parts of his family while still maintaining his independence. The museum doors opened early. A familiar figure stepped inside. Mia turned. "I thought you were stuck in traffic." James grinned as he approached. "I might have exaggerated." He handed her a small wrapped package. "For your big day." Inside was an antique silver bookmark, engraved with a Renaissance design. Mia traced the intricate pattern with her fingers. "It reminded me of you," James said. "Beautiful but practical." Mia rolled her eyes. Smooth talker. But the warmth in her chest was undeniable. As guests began arriving, Mia took a moment to observe James from across the room. He was chatting with her colleagues, moving through the world differently now. Confident, at ease, not because of his last name, but because he finally knew who he was. Their relationship wasn't perfect. They still argued about money sometimes. Mia's ingrained frugality clashing with James's occasional splurges. Trust had taken time to rebuild, with setbacks along the way. But standing here, watching her personal and professional worlds merge seamlessly, Mia felt something she hadn't before, a profound sense of rightness. Their story hadn't followed any conventional path. There had been no dramatic rescues, no grand sacrifices, just two people, choosing each other, day after day. despite their differences. As the exhibition officially opened, Mia stepped forward to give her welcome speech. She caught James's encouraging smile from the crowd. And she smiled back, because sometimes the most extraordinary journey begins with the simplest gesture, like offering spare change to a stranger on a bus. If you loved Mia and James's journey, don't forget to like, comment, and share this story. Do you believe in second chances? Tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know. Subscribe for more stories that prove even the smallest moments can change destinies. Because you never know, a single act of kindness might be the beginning of something extraordinary.